Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan features two radio professionals with over 100 years of broadcasting experience between them. Dave Hogan and Randy Houston are both native Western North Carolinians whose rich voices have been heard in every glade, cove, and holler of Western North Carolina and East Tennessee, primarily on AM radio. And between the two of them, they've worked in just about every radio format. As you can imagine, these guys have tons of stories about the day-to-day of live radio and the interactions they've had with listeners and entertainers while they were immersed in, at the time, one of the most influential and informative mediums available. Those experiences will be featured in this podcast series. Check the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts with Randy and Dave on Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another podcast of Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. I'm Randy Houston.
And this is Dave Hogan, and my mic is hot.
Your mic is hot.
My mic is hot.
Well, it's good to be back with you, Dave, talking on the podcast machine. We've talked on the radio machine so many years between the two of us. We, just to catch you up a little bit, we've both spent many years in the broadcast business. Dave has retired after a career of 57 years in radio in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. I've been in the business now about 51 or 2 years, and I'm still going. I still get up in the wee hours of the morning and head off to WHKP in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and I am so blessed to be doing a classic country format there, and it's kind of Randy Radio 0.20 because I'm doing principally the same thing in radio right now that I did back in the 80s. And that's why it makes it so easy for me to play classic, what we call classic country now today, because I lived it then and you did too, Dave.
I sure did. You know, I know you have a song of inspiration, right, every morning on your show?
I do.
And I can remember practically every country music artist had one gospel song on each album. We talked about Loretta Lynn
right
on one of our podcasts, and Loretta Lynn early on would include a gospel song, and then she's made some purely gospel albums. And gospel music and country music have always been intertwined, going all the way back to the early days of Jimmy Rogers and people like that, the Carter family. Country music and gospel music have been intertwined, but there are different types of gospel music, just as there are different types of country music. And the old-time Southern gospel harmony is still very popular, and still, when you come to the Hogan house, I may have the Blackwood Brothers or the Stamps Quartet pulled up on the iPad and listening. I just can't you never get away from that kind of music once you hear it, once you spend time listening to these great gospel quartets.
We've talked about it before on the show, how you got started with a Sunday morning hymn time on WSKY here in Asheville, North Carolina, back in the 60s.
I got started under an old revival tent.
That's where it got started.
Yeah, that's where it got started. My dad was a preacher, and he and his preacher friends would run tent revivals. And occasionally you hear about one now, but back when I was growing up, it was very common to drive down the roadway during the summertime and see a tent out in the field. And a sign up says revival. And it would have the name of the preachers and what time the service started. And they'd plan it for a week, and oftentimes it would go longer, if the crowds were coming. And we're talking about a time before television and going to revivals, going to church, and they called them count meetings also in the old days, was, in addition to a religious experience, it was a social activity.
Right.
And so my dad, he hired me, so to speak. Pay wasn't very much.
Radio's
to be
never paid much.
A disc jockey.
We still don't get paid very well.
Under that gospel tent during the summer months.
Okay, how old
You know,
are you?
I'm 12 years old,
Okay.
and I've got this old 78 RPM record player that's hooked into the PA system. And, you know, these big old PA...
Horn speakers.
Looked like a horn, you know, and they'd put one on each side of the tent up on a pole. You had one of these big horns, one on each side. And my job was to, along about an hour before time for the meeting to start, my job was to play music, play gospel music.
Now, this was a fancy operation, I'm telling you.
That was how I got into the DJ business. I was a DJ before radio. And my dad was a particular fan of the world famous Chuck Wagon Gang from Fort Worth, Texas.
Oh, boy.
So I had a lot of 78 RPM Chuck Wagon Gang records. And I sat there. Now, there was no chatter, no talking.
Yeah.
I just played the music. One record, one would finish, and I'd have to take
Change
it off,
it.
put another one on, take it off, put another one on. And so that was my first DJ job.
So that's where you got started playing
that's where I
gospel
got started.
music.
And so I just never could during my career get away very far from playing gospel music. I always wanted to do it no matter what format I was working. You know, it's common for gospel music to be played on to an extent on a country music radio station, or at least it was in years past. But when we were working at WISE back in the 90s, and we were playing songs from the Great American Songbook, they called it the Stardust format, I believe.
Right.
And we were playing Frank Sinatra and Barbra Streisand, lots of big band music. We also had a Sunday morning gospel program.
Yeah.
So,
And that Sunday morning gospel program stemmed from your days at WSKY. Sunday mornings from 6 to 10 or 11 a.m. You played gospel music. And there's about 10 years in the difference in our ages. Dave is my senior. And I was at...
And don't you forget it, buddy. Don't you forget it.
I bought his lunch. Come on. And my grandmother lived in North Asheville, Weaverville, I guess it was. And I was there one Sunday morning and spent the night with my grandmother. There was a radio on top of the refrigerator. And I heard this music coming from the refrigerator. And I saw my grandmother lean on that refrigerator to get closer to that radio and the song that was playing and the music that was coming from it. And I could see my grandmother was emotional. And what's going on here? What is coming out of that radio that's making her? And so I paid attention, and it was Sunday morning hymn time that she was listening to. And from that day forward, I learned a lot on that day about the power of radio, and I also learned about gospel music. Growing up in a Southern Baptist church, and hearing the piano music and in the church, and then here it is on the radio, and it's having that kind of an impact on my grandmother. There's something to this, and that's where I started really paying attention.
And you and I were at a restaurant recently, and somebody walked in that you were acquainted with. And you started speaking to them and introduced the gentleman to me. And then later his wife came over. And they were listeners of mine on WSKY 50 years ago.
50 years
My
ago.
goodness, 50 years ago. And still remembered some of the songs that I played on Gospel Hymn Time, 6 till 10 on Sunday morning. And if you'll recall on one of our podcasts, I told you how that program came about.
Yeah. Libby and Chuck Waldrop, who we ran into, and Libby and Chuck both part of the group, the Emmanuels. At the time, they were talking 50 years ago, that you'd written the liner notes for an album of theirs that I had played on WWNC, and I didn't realize that these are Dave Hogan's. That was the thought that hit my mind when they said you'd written the liner notes. I said, well, I bet I played that on a competing radio station.
And I mentioned my dad was a Chuckwagon Gang fan, and of course I became a fan of the Chuckwagon Gang as well. And in my later years, after growing up, getting into the radio business, I met the Peacemakers Quartet.
Oh, yeah.
Gerald Cox was one of the members of the Peacemakers. And
yes.
Gerald and I got together, and I wrote the lyrics, and he wrote the music to a couple of songs that were recorded by the Chuckwagon Gang. And I don't think my dad ever appreciated the profession that I went into until the Chuckwagon Gang recorded
a song of yours,
a couple of songs that I wrote. So one of them was called Bible for a Souvenir, and I kind of wrote it in memory of my grandfather, who carried a Bible with him most everywhere he went.
Really?
And he would sit on his front porch and read the Bible every day. And so the gist of the song is, I know I'll not need it, but it's been a friend so dear. May I take my Bible for a souvenir?
Wow.
And so the Chuckwagon Gang recorded that song, and then wrote another song called Please, Sweet Jesus, Rescue Me, recorded by the Chuckwagon Gang, and it was included in the Chuckwagon Gang songbooks. So what a thrill that was.
I bet.
And I was surfing the internet one day, and I ran into Bible for a Souvenir, that song that I wrote, being sung by a member of the First Baptist Church in some town in Texas.
Really?
Yeah.
I bet that was a thrill.
So that was a thrill, not to have any idea. I don't know how I came across it, that my song had been performed and filmed and was on YouTube.
Well, that is great.
That was quite a thrill. But down through the years, you and I both became fans of the Blackwood Brothers Quartet,
oh, yeah.
the Hovey Lister and the Statesman Quartet, the Stamps Quartet, the Lefevre Trio, and the Lefevre family. As the family grew, it started out the Lefevre Trio, and as the family grew, it just became the Lefevres. Wonderful people. And all you talk about wonderful people, the Spear family. Great people.
Yeah.
And I used to MC some programs for, and you may remember, the Reverend J. Basil Mull.
Oh, the world famous Mull's Singing Convention. Post Office Box 6, Knoxville, Tennessee.
Ain't that right, Lady Mull?
That's right.
He was a friend of my dad's, and later me. I remember my first experience with J. Basil Mull was when I was probably 10, 12 years old. He was an ordained preacher.
Right.
And before he got into the promotion of gospel music, he lost his eyesight. He got into the promotion of gospel music, but he was a full-time preacher, and he came to my home church, Valleytown Baptist Church in Andrews, North Carolina, and ran a revival.
Okay.
And stayed at our house. And that's when I first met J. Basil Mull. And down through the years, I'll never forget this. My dad was in the hospital in Knoxville, on the west side of town. And there's a Cracker Barrel restaurant right near the hospital. My wife and I were eating at the Cracker Barrel, and I think somebody else was with us, and we were just talking, and I heard somebody say, "Is that Preacher Hogan's boy over there?" And I looked around. It was J. Basil Mull. Now, he was blind, totally blind at the time.
That's right.
And he heard my voice. I hadn't seen or talked to J. Basil Mull in many years, and he recognized my voice. He had been to visit my dad at the hospital and stopped at the Cracker Barrel and
y'all ran
heard
into
my
each other.
voice. Is that Preacher Hogan's boy over there? But he promoted gospel singings. He used to call them all-night singings. Wally Fowler was a big promoter of the all-night singings.
Did they sing all night, Dave?
Well, most of the night. I think they knocked off around 2 a.m. usually, but
wow,
it the name All Night Singings stuck.
It did, didn't it?
Yeah. Wally Fowler got in a little bit of trouble there one time. He would advertise, now picture this in your mind, a billboard advertising the singing, all night singing, presented by Wally Fowler. And he would list 2 or 3 of the groups who were going to be singing. And then in very tiny print, he would have also invited, and then he would have the names of a bunch of other quartets
Artists.
That if you just took a quick look at the lettering, you would think that all these quartets are going to be there. But in fine print, it said also invited. But he would have those singings at the Ryman Auditorium. They didn't used to have a Friday night Opry. They had just Saturday night, and he'd have the gospel sing on Friday night. Then when it started Friday night Opry, he moved his all-night singings to the Municipal Auditorium there in Nashville, as well as taking them around the country, on tour. He would have all these quartets lined up and come to your town with the Wally Fowler all-night singing. And, Wally Fowler was a singer himself, and he organized the Oak Ridge Boys.
That's where I remember the name Wally Fowler from. Yeah.
Wally Fowler and the Oak Ridge Boys.
Yep.
And the Oak Ridge Boys were put together as a quartet to entertain at Oak Ridge, Tennessee,
at the plant.
When they were developing the atomic bomb in World War II. And it was top secret. And you had to have a top secret clearance to get inside the gates at Oak Ridge. Top secret. The Manhattan Project. And this quartet, the Oak Ridge Boys, that's how they got their name. And, of course, they sang gospel music strictly, purely, for many years, and then got into the country field. And, of course, the personnel changed. Dwayne Allen became the front man for the quartet. I remember Dwayne was up at WSKY before they recorded their first country, quote-unquote, country song, and was asking me, do you think it would be okay? Do you think people would accept us in country music, the Oak Ridge Boys, or should we change our name and record under some other name? And I said, if it's good, if people like it, it doesn't matter what the name is. So they kept the name Oak Ridge Boys and then came out with, what was the first big song the Oak Ridge Boys had?
Was it Elvira?
No, it was before Elvira.
Before Elvira?
Yeah.
Fancy Free was I'll Be True to You. You're right. They went through a time there, they called themselves the Oaks, and it was a tumultuous time for them to make that transition from gospel music to country music. A lot of the gospel music fans said, oh, you're turning coat, you're going out there and going to sing in the beer joints now, ain't you? Yep, and so that was a transition for the Oak Ridge Boys. And, as we said before, country and gospel music always have had this intertwined relationship, because most all of the major artists of country have recorded a gospel album, and that files right into my classic country show that I do, I was telling you about earlier, and have a Song of Faith every morning, and I have a big selection of the classic country artists who did a gospel song or a gospel album, and modern artists. Well, Alan Jackson's not considered a modern artist, but of the later generations, Alan Jackson did one heck of an incredible job on an album of gospel standards, and I still play that today. Dolly Parton, I played this morning Zach Williams and Dolly Parton, and There Was Jesus. What an incredible production. And Dolly's version with Brad Paisley of When I Get Where I'm Going. Incredible song. So the gospel music plays right into the country thing that Dave and I have done for so many years. And of course, one of the things that I think, Dave, you ought to be awfully proud of is that Sunday morning hymn time show. It transcended. You left Asheville in 77 and went to Tennessee and started doing the show immediately over there.
WJCW.
And I'm one of the ones who missed it in Asheville. Where did Sunday morning go? Where did Dave go? So, you went over there, and this was days before the internet. We couldn't get WJCW over here across the mountain, and we were lost. And then you came back to Asheville and joined me, and we got together in 93 at Wise. And I'm serious, man. The phone started ringing.
You go where the work is, Randy. You go where you can get a job.
Well, you had a great history and a great run in Asheville, and people remembered that, and we stuck that show back on Wise Radio on Sunday mornings.
Speaking of things coming back, it finally came to me. The name of that Oak Ridge Boys song, the first hit.
What was it?
The All Come Back Saloon.
Oh, yeah. She played tambourine with a silver jingle.
That was their first big country music hit. 1977.
Yeah. Those all-night gospel singings. The joke around is that they didn't sing all night. They sung till the money run out. And then they said, it's time to go home, boys. That's what they said. They took up 3 offerings, and that last one was kind of puny, so it's time to go home now, folks.
Well, I think in a lot of cases they just charged an entry fee.
Yeah, an entry fee.
Yeah.
Bill Gaither. We can't talk about gospel music without bringing up that name.
Exactly. He did tremendous, and still doing a tremendous job in keeping alive gospel music and helping us always remember the Happy Goodmans.
Yes.
And these names that we grew up with in gospel music, and he called it the Homecoming. Bill Gaither's Gospel Music Homecoming. And the videos and the recordings, the CDs, the DVDs have really kept alive gospel music.
Ran into an old friend the other day, and he tickled me to death. I said, what are you doing now? He said, I'm retired. Ain't doing nothing but sitting around and watching them Gaither videos.
I'll tell you somebody else that had a great impact singing gospel music was Tennessee Ernie Ford.
Oh, one of my favorite all-time singers, man.
Yeah, he sang he sang all kinds of music. 16 tons. Sing 16 tons, and what do you get? One day older and deeper in debt.
St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go, 'cause I owe my soul to the company store.
He was from Bristol, Tennessee.
The little old pea picker himself, Tennessee Ernie Ford.
WJCW, the radio station I worked for in Johnson City, the initial stood for James C. Wilson. And James C. Wilson put on the first radio station in the Tri-Cities, WOPI in Bristol. Now, I worked for the son of James C. Wilson, who owned and put on the air WOPI in Bristol, and he had the distinction of firing Tennessee Ernie Ford. He said, boy, you need to find another occupation. You're not going to make it in this business. So he fired Tennessee Ernie.
Oh, my.
And that story still goes around in the Tri-Cities. The man that fired
Tennessee Ernie
Ford. And Tennessee Ernie Ford went on. If you watch some of the old Tennessee Ernie Ford shows on YouTube, he was a tremendous entertainer.
Yes.
Yeah. And he transcended pop music, country music. He was a good pop singer, but he also never got away from his roots, and that was gospel music.
He was a good actor. He guest made there was a recurrent character on I Love Lucy that was played by Tennessee Ernie Ford.
Yep, you're exactly right.
He was incredible, and some of those gospel classic great albums that he recorded on the RCA label back in the day was backed up by groups like the Imperials, and speaking of another name that we got to bring up when we talk about gospel music, because he was as much a fan of it as you and I are, and that's Elvis Presley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think I told this story on a previous podcast, but this is a good time to repeat it since we're talking about gospel music and Elvis. When Hovey Lister and the Statesmen would appear in Memphis, Elvis would come out to see them unannounced, and he would slip in backstage. And Hovey and the Statesmen were wrapping up their show one night, and they were saying, good night, folks. Hope you've enjoyed the show. And everybody stood up and started cheering and clapping their hands. And Hovey didn't know that Elvis had walked out behind the quartet. And everybody's going crazy over Elvis Presley. And Hovey thought they were clapping for the quartet.
Elvis was a tremendous fan. Of course, he traveled with J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet for many, many years, and they were the backup when he passed away. And in our closing few minutes, we may have to do a second podcast on gospel music because we ain't touched the surface here. By
the way, the only Grammy Elvis won in his career, the Grammy is an award for recording excellence. The only Grammy was for his gospel album.
And it was incredible. And another name in Asheville, North Carolina that I can't not mention being a native son here, and that's Eldridge Fox of the Kingsmen Quartet. One of our dearest friends, and we miss him so much. But you talk about a promoter and a lover of Southern gospel music and taking the Kingsmen Quartet to incredible heights.
Yeah, and he was persistent. If there's any word that described Eldridge Fox better than any other, persistence. He stayed with it.
Yeah.
Up and down. I mean, it wasn't easy.
Right.
Keeping a quartet together. And a lot of people think if you record music, you make a lot of money. That's not necessarily so. Some people get lucky and they make a lot of money, but most people barely make a living.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases. I remember one time Eldridge called me, and he said he was managing Cagle Music Company at the time, down at the corner of Patton Avenue and Cox Avenue.
Yeah.
And he called me, and he said, when you get off the air, he said, come down here. I want you to hear something. So I went down there, and he put a record on the turntable and turned the speaker up. This voice came out. It was Squire Parsons and Sweet Beulah Land.
Another great
Squire
singer.
Parsons.
Oh,
and, of
Dave.
course, Squire made his home in Asheville, sang with the Kingsmen Quartet for many, many years, closely associated with the Trinity Baptist Church in Asheville.
As I said, we've only touched the surface. We can't forget our friends, the Primitive Quartet.
Oh, my goodness. I remember when the Primitive made their first album.
But we got to go. We'll be back. We'll talk more.
I don't want to go.
I don't either. Bye. Thank you, Hot Mike, Houston and Hogan. We appreciate y'all listening.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mike with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.